Of course, my viewers know that African Ascent has been conspicuously absent from the Boston cultural visual scene for about 3 months now. And it's a great pleasure for African Ascent that takes great pride in interacting with my precious audience out there to come back to you with a special event in which we will remember a very tragic death of a promising young videographer whose work we will share with you tonight. African Ascent is simply delighted to announce that this special series will comment in memory of this tragic death, and we have entitled it Vision and Social Movements. The best way of introducing the death of this promising videographer, among many other things, is to share with you a moving portrait of hers that was painted by her own husband, George Katsifikas, who is a leading theorist of the American New Left and who currently is a professor of sociology and political science at Wentworth Institute of Technology. This particular video that we'll share with you momentarily will be the subject of John, a good friend of mine, famous in his own right, the author of classic works such as How Harvard Rules the World, that was published by Southern Press, and another major work of his on Hollywood, How Hollywood Sells to the World, produced by Cambridge University Press. So what I thought I would do to this important event is to read a portrait of the videographer as presented by her husband, Professor George Katsifikas, in which he says the following. It's written to all friends. With overwhelming sadness, I report the death on November 2nd of Shin Yoon Young. I remember her as Bada, my beloved wife and partner, my best friend and fellow activist and intellectual. When you next see me, I may not be able to talk coherently about this great tragedy, not only an enormous personal loss beyond words for me, but a huge tragedy for all of us who basked in the generosity of her spirit, who experienced her beautiful smile, and who felt the openness with which she approached life. Those of us who love peace and justice will also feel a missing link in our lives. In her all too short 40 years on this planet, Bada, her Korean nickname, moved from being a student activist at Shonam National University in her native Gwangju to television writer, human rights film festival organizer, documentary filmmaker, and scholarly author. Moving on from her decade-long career as a television writer at the Korean Broadcast System and Gwangju Broadcast Company, she began to make documentary films, first as part of an all-female collective preserving the life histories of women who toiled long years in day in market in Gwangju, where people galvanized an historic uprising in 1980 and dealt a fatal blow to the generals who sought to dominate South Korea. With her friend Choi Song-nyuk, EJ then filmed the struggle of the families of people who perished during the Great Uprising to preserve the building where their loved ones were killed while making their last stand against US-supplied tanks and helicopters. Making her own films, she produced first a history of the May 18th uprising in Gwangju, which showed just last week in Germany. As she was making her documentary, she was thrilled one evening to discover her own grandfather sitting in white farmer's clothing in the midst of a massive citizens' meeting where direct democratic forms of government prevailed, while people gallantly defended their besieged city from the onslaught of US-backed paratroopers. Her major documentary, and a contribution that will outlive all of us, is Veritas, Everybody Loves Harvard, a 60-minute expose of Harvard's hidden history. To create both Korean and English versions, E.J. spent the better part of a year in archival research, interviewing people, perusing books, documents, newspaper articles, and the internet as she compiled with amazing accuracy and depth insight into dimensions of Harvard's history often concealed from public view. Verita Daller won her an award as Best Director of a documentary at the New York International Film Festival in 2011. E.J. then traveled with the film to Turkey, where it was shown in more than a dozen cities, to San Francisco, and to half a dozen cities in South Korea. As the tragedy cut short her life, she was working on an English translation of the Korean book version of Verita. A memorial service was held for E.J. at 5 p.m. on Monday, November 5th, 2012, at the MIT Chapel. We wore purple, her favorite color, and you are invited to do so in her memory. Written by George Katsifikas, along with his daughters Cassandra and Dalal. Indeed, George said it the best. How could anybody top what only a husband could extrapolate by entering into the interiors of another human being? But I also know that you knew Bada quite well. You've been hanging out with the Katsifikases for quite a while.
Yes, well, she got to work on this movie about Harvard, and I think she had come up with a really great formula, because she would work on the film, and then she would also produce a companion book. And she really was somebody who got to the roots of things, in the sense of the word we talk to be radical. She really was not so interested in the surface things that people who learn about Harvard University. She really wanted to know who ruled the institution, who it was ruled for, where is the power in the institution. And in some ways, I think she saw in her country, Korea, people just striving so hard to get into this institution, but sometimes people weren't asking for what or for why. Why did they want to be part of this place? And so she really got deeply into the power structure. You can meet students at Harvard University many times. They don't even know that Harvard has been ruled by the oldest corporation in the Western Hemisphere, the Harvard Corporation, which throughout its history has been 7 people, self-selected, meeting always semi-secretly, making decisions, an endowment that's over $30 billion, largest university endowment in the world. And you know, the people who run the place, they don't want people asking these questions. And I think what I had said at the memorial service is, I talked about this debate that was held, very famous debate back in the 1970s between the MIT intellectual Noam Chomsky and France's Michel Foucault. And Foucault at one point said that one of the most urgent tasks of our movements, we have to understand how there's many institutions in our society in which people look on them as neutral or objective. And what a critical intelligentsia has to do is unmask the neutrality and try to show really who are the powerful interests that they serve. And I think Bada, many ways, her life work, she was trying to do that unmasking of these institutions and trying to help people understand how they work deep down.
Mm-hmm. So it's remarkable then, following that debate between Chomsky and Foucault, for me to surmise that this documentary in many, many ways is an example of what Foucault would call genealogical work. It is both archaeological in the sense that it focuses on the structures of institutions, but it's also a genealogy in a way, because what the documentary does, correct me if I'm wrong, is, as you say, unmask and expose the interior structures of what goes on inside Harvard, although on the surface all that individuals know about Harvard is that it is a first-rate institution, as if it has no history, as if it has no task, as if it has no purpose, without purposiveness, to throw a Kantian term at you. So this documentary then is a living example of a genealogy of some kind.
Yes, yes. I think she, you know, people hear these terms about Harvard. It's, you would refer to its motto, slogan, Veritas, which she picked for the book, which in Latin means truth. And that was always the image, that Harvard is just there as an institution to pursue truth. But as Bada got deeply into that history, she saw how some of the truths that got pursued were really sometimes very terrifyingly serving certain interests. For instance, in the late 19th century, Harvard brought one of the greatest scientists in the world, a Swiss scientist, Louis Agassiz. But Agassiz, despite having some impressive scientific work, he was a ferociously racist man. He taught people, for instance, that his science had shown that, for instance, if an African person, black person, had a brain that was only the size of a 7-month-old fetus of a white child, and that if they were pressed to learn harder and harder to learn, the brain wall would cause a pressure on the skull and it could break. And he would just talk about this like he knew these as scientific truths. And I think Bada was someone very curious, wanting to find out how did these people come up with these ideas, to the point where in the United States, a lot of people don't realize this, but in the early 20th century, many states passed sterilization laws, for instance, and in places like Virginia, several thousand people were sterilized forcibly. And Harvard experts were often ones who were consulted, saying that this was necessary to uplift the gene pool in our society and things. And so things that people just accepted as truths, you know, when she really dug more deeply in them, you could see that this is reason in the service of barbarism, or as I had my book was subtitled, Reason in the Service of Empire, because I think Harvard so many times has served powerful imperial interests. And you know, she was really trying to bring out a side to the university that many other people were not interested in looking at. And this year was this past year was the 375th anniversary of Harvard. So this was the one really critical vision of the university that had come out, whereas everything else was just the traditional celebratory thing, saying how great we are the best and the brightest. And a lot of this heritage that we're talking about today, that just has gotten swept under the rug. And you know, it took great political and social movements to end some of that kind of teaching, but there still are new forms of reactionary thought that goes on in the university that's dressed up as truth and veritas. And so, you know, I think she really devoted herself to try to help people to see these things in our time. It's not just the past. There's many things that are going on right now. And I'd just give one example, how much she took interest, how on the 375th anniversary, late in the anniversary year, Harvard brought Henry Kissinger and very much honored him and paid tribute to him as one of the great representatives of Harvard intellect. But you know, that was to mask over several million Vietnamese people died in the Vietnam War. Most Americans seem to be aware that 58,000 U.S. soldiers died, but they're not really aware that 2.5, 3.5 million Vietnamese died in the course of this great war. And so I think she was somebody that really tried to open people's perspectives a lot more wider to see the carnage and destruction that many of these policies had caused. And you know, she was really a very inspiring person, very interested in student movements, and trying to help people develop self-activity so that they could see the possibilities of social change and not just because sometimes we talk about the things we are, you can get very depressed and down and feel hopeless. But she was one who was trying to help you see some of the bad things, but also show you that it could be turned around.
Mm-hmm. Is it an accident that the video's name resembles remarkably with the title of your own Southern book? How well did Bada know your work?
Well, she read it very carefully, and I know in the Korean edition she did cite my book quite a bit, but she, really updated a lot of things. She did a lot of hard work on her own. It was not just my work. She tried to put a lot of new effort to understand the things that happened. When I had done the book, it was back in 1989. In fact, I was inspired to do the book because 1986 was the 350th anniversary of Harvard, and everything that seemed to come out was just, we are the greatest university in the world. And oftentimes the only discordant note, for instance, a book that came out, Glimpses from the Harvard Past, that started denouncing the community, saying that the community doesn't appreciate our greatness. But I sometimes had sympathy with the community sometimes, with its disagreements with the university. Sometimes the university doesn't want to listen to members of the community, but they have some valid criticisms of many of the destructive policies sometimes pursued by the leadership. And the leadership, because they're not listening, because it's insulated from any democratic accountability, it's just easy for them to ignore these things. So I got inspired by the 350th. In some ways, I think she saw the 375th anniversary coming, but she did a lot of work to really update. And think about this during that time period. Harvard's endowment when I was writing in 1989 was $5 billion. It had gone up to close to $37 billion, but then with the economic collapse, it dropped down to the high 20s, and now it's a little over $30 billion, which is still an amazing return on investment. But Harvard, of course, has been recently crying poverty to a lot of people because it dropped from its peak in 2007. And so, they're very much calling on austerity from the workers and the people who are in more ordinary walks of life at the university, and lots of people have lost their jobs, and the people who are the very highly paid people at the top seem to keep doing very, very well for themselves, the institutions working for them, but the workers more at the lower level jobs at the university, they really had to pay the price when this happened, and it's caused a time that's been a very, very tough time for workers at the university in recent years because of this downturn. But you can see if you put it in a little bit of a longer perspective, that's a remarkable return on investment to go from 5 to well over $30 billion.
That's right. What I was thinking as I'm listening to you too is this. I wonder how popular first your book and secondly this video could possibly be at Harvard, since it's an indictment of Harvard.
Yes.
Do these works in some shape or form threaten your livelihood, your career at the law school?
Well, there's people who express that they're unhappy, and I would say maybe the way that it threatens me a little bit is, I'm not going to be someone they're going to look to promote to the higher circles of power at the university, certainly. But I must say at my particular program, which is a labor studies program, the people have been very strong and loyal, and the labor movement has supported me in the past. And so for that reason, I've been very fortunate. And I don't like to talk like I'm some, terrible victim, because I've been able to have a career, and we know how many people are suffering in academia today with so many low-paid adjunct jobs. And meanwhile, we have, just the latest list of all the university presidents now making over $1 million. There's so many now. It used to be seen as a little more of a public service job. I noticed Andrew Hacker wrote a book recently, and he was saying how, the U.S. president, maybe earns $450,000 a year. Is it too much to ask that a university president is paid? And more in that line. But now a lot of them want to be paid more like corporate CEOs now.
I believe the president at MIT, I was recently looking at the current data, I think commands about $2 million, I believe, and I was stunned to discover that Harvard's president, on the other hand, comparatively speaking, is making less than $1 million.
That's true.
So when I was preparing for this interview, I was awestruck by that.
Yes. Well, I think it is true that I think Harvard's a little nervous about the president actually breaking that $1 million barrier because they know it will make a lot of news stories. And so the president often gets a lot of free perks and things, but the salary, last time from 2 years ago that it was released, I believe it was around $855,000, so they're getting close. But many other universities, it's true, but I think that
Boston University, MIT, Harvard was fourth. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, in the Boston
Northeastern University.
Yeah, I think he's making over $1 million too.
That's right.
But I think at Harvard, where people make the very big money, in fact, are the people who run the Harvard Management Company.
I see.
Because many of them will be making over $5 million a year. And so the people who handle the investments, and sometimes people who want to give big money to the university get really upset because, for instance, somebody did a study saying that 5 managers at the corporation, the management company, were making something close to the combined salaries of all 400 faculty members on the arts and sciences faculty. But what happens sometimes is that the people who are in the management company, they will get very angry and they'll say, well, we could make more money if we leave Harvard and then work down on Wall Street. And they portray themselves, even though they may make over $5 million. I will say, Jane Mendillo, who's the manager, I think hers was $3.6 million last year. But then she has individuals who do some of the investing who sometimes earn more than her. But what happens is they say, well, we can make more money if we go off and just join a hedge fund or something like that. And so why are you attacking us? But the curious thing is I've noticed when some of them leave Harvard and work for these hedge funds, a lot of them, their performance drops incredibly. And I think the reason that is, people don't write about this. Maybe I won't be bold enough to accuse them of insider trading. But I do think when you work on the Harvard Management Company, you have a lot of powerful alumni who come to you and give you a lot of inside information. We can debate whether it's crossing the legal line, but you're getting a lot of information that then when you go out on your own, those people aren't calling you up because oftentimes you are maybe their competitor, but they will show loyalty to their alma mater and help out. And so there's access to information that you wouldn't normally get. And I think that's something that's helped some of these university endowments over the years really outperform the market tremendously. And that's where when I talk about this, 6-fold increase in the endowment over these 2 decades, I think that's a factor in it. But it's something that doesn't get written about much or examined. People look at the endowments, but the question of how is it that so many of them outperform the market? People recently were scandalized by saying, how did Bernie Madoff outperform the market for so long? And eventually his thing got exposed. But I think it is an interesting question how the universities, there's particular ones that seem like they just always do better. And I do notice this drop-off of performance when they leave the university.
And now to return to Bada before we
Yes.
begin sharing the video itself. I was thinking about this also. How is
Impressive test scores. They counted. You might not make the cutoff for your year. So I think there is a curiosity about some of the elite universities around the world out there. And I think she was fascinated by, back in Korea, how some families made just incredible sacrifices. I mean, I meet a lot of Koreans who send their children to, say, Phillips Exeter and Andover. You know, most people from abroad, they often, if they are going to go for education in the United States, they typically wait until graduate school. But in Korea, you'll see people, the parents say, you better get ahead of the game, and they will pay a lot of money to get them into a secondary school, a private high school, in hopes that they can then get the edge to get into the places.
So it's remarkable. So in the case of Bada, since she herself, unlike you, did not go to Harvard, and I remember a conversation I had with her, she was humorously telling me after the video came out in New York that all these Harvard graduates, such as you, who in addition teach at Harvard, pointedly asked her, how is it that you became interested in Harvard since you yourself did not go to Harvard? Yes. So what she has done is, which is very Foucauldian, she was motivated to study the Harvard phenomena in Korea from the living effects of the interests and passions of the Korean ruling class. So in her case, the masking is double-pronged. Yes. It's the masking of an American institution, but it is also the masking of a non-American population doing anything that it could to send its children to a leading institution such as Harvard. So she's unmasking two phenomena at the same time.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think, you know, she was working on a lot of different levels, and she was a person who was very involved in global movements. She was involved with the student movement in her own country, in Korea, but over here, you know, one of the things was she took a lot of interest in the Occupy movements here. Right. She really wanted to get to know the Occupy people at Harvard, and there were some who came to her movie, but you know, the sad thing was Harvard really cracked down very hard on the Occupy movement. People maybe forget this in Boston, but for several months they locked the gates to the university. You had to provide a lot of ID. They could stop you and ask you, why are you coming on campus? It was very strange to have a place that billed very much as an open university, be on lockdown.
Committed to truth.
Yeah, you know, so that's how devoted they were to saying, we do not want this Occupy movement to get momentum. And I think they were worried that the Occupy movement might develop some strength at Harvard. And so they decided, let's keep the community out. Let's not have the students meet wider group of activists, and let's hope that with the cold weather, with exams finishing, the students would eventually disperse. And sadly, I have to say, some of their repression strategy, at least this time around, worked. But I will also say that in future times, I think movements have to get smarter and adjust to the next time and see what they can do, realizing the lengths to which the university will go to try to prevent an activist movement from having success. But, you know, I think Bada was very interested in trying to help a movement get stronger. But I think she was somebody who felt that people have to be careful not to just participate, maybe you might call it a mindless militancy. You have to have knowledge to fight your battles and to become a strong movement. The battle of ideas are very important. So you can wage a much stronger social movement and political campaign if you have a lot of knowledge behind it. So I think she was very dedicated to that and helping the movement develop some of the resources to help out in the struggles ahead.
Okay. And now I think it is time for us to share with the public the content of the video itself. While we are preparing to do that, we might want to continue talking a little more about certain salient features of Badass project that you'd like to bring to my audience's attention.
Okay. The most prestigious.
The brief thing that we saw, how do you assess its technical proficiency by way of introducing the project of unmasking? How well do you think she did?
Well, I think, in the beginning, I think she sort of wanted to show a very seemingly innocent tour of Harvard, so people would sort of see what you are normally told when you come to Harvard.
Famous statue.
Yes. That statue is the third most photographed statue in the United States. So many people, you'll see whole buses pull in, and then everybody gets off and they go straight to that statue. And usually the people presenting it, as you could see in the film, humorously say, well, it's known as a statue of three lies because there's sort of mistakes on the statue, the wrong date for the founding, calling John Harvard the founder. He really was a benefactor. He was somebody who donated a lot of books to Harvard, and they decided, well, let's name the university after. But she sort of uses that to poke just a little bit of fun to say, well, if they got it all wrong on this statue, what else is it that they're not really telling you that's actually a lot more serious about the university? You can kind of laugh a little bit at these maybe small errors on the tour, but once she really digs into the whole history of the various types of misuse of science, the foreign policy history, some of the very scary racism that's gone on through the centuries. It really opens your eyes to a very different vision of the university's history, and it's something that sometimes people don't really want to confront who have done very well by the university.
You're quite right. For example, when I did postgraduate work at Harvard, I used to hang out when John Rawls was alive. Mm-hmm. I took all his political philosophy courses. I was one of his students. So I used to go to the Agassiz building. Mm-hmm. How little did I know that this is the Agassiz, the portrait of whom is barbarously racist, as you present it. And I wonder how many innocent individuals like me have been basking in the architectural presence of a building named after a very disturbing human being.
Yes, and he was an example of somebody who, again, taught people that what he was saying was just based on scientific research. He said that he had I have, no passions or hatreds at all. I'm just reporting you the basic findings of science. Of course, people later on discovered his diaries, and they were really, you could tell how much he hated African peoples in the diaries. He talked about how being in their presence, he would get nauseous. He would say some really terrible things, and so it's a remarkable thing, like you say, that he is somebody who still is a very, in some ways, highly honored person. I noticed in Switzerland there was a movement to get his name moved from one of the mountains, but the Swiss parliament voted it down, even though there was a big political movement to try to change it. So there have been people over the years that have, tried to say, look, this isn't what we want to honor in our places, but it's there's many things like that, and I think Bada tried very hard to try to help people to understand the connections between universities and foreign policy ideas as well. It wasn't just about science. The university plays a lot of role in also the university being sometimes having so many dominant figures from the finance world. We have an economy dominated by financialization. You know, I think about, you know, recently the Harvard Business School had its 100th anniversary, and people at that time were a little bit angry given that our economy has really been left in shambles after this great mischief that was done by many of the finance people. But the Harvard Business School, the name of their century celebration was "Who Will Lead?" And I noticed the Financial Times said, well, the obvious answer is we will lead. They are continuing. There's not really a lot of self-examination or looking inward and saying, what did we do wrong? How can we change things after this terrible thing had happened? And I think in some ways she was trying to pose some of the questions about, you know, are there better ways of finding intellectual leadership and asking the questions and probing the powerful and trying to see other ways of organizing society. So, you know, for that, you know, very, very grateful to her effort, and it's just such a terrible loss, somebody that
such a young age.
Yeah, very shocking to all of us. So.
Perhaps we'll go to the video and see a few more facets. All right, so from here, I think what we could do is also talk a little more in depth about some of the leading intellectuals that Bada interviewed in the video. I'm thinking in terms of Levine of the medical school,
yes,
and the great Chomsky himself, yourself, Victor Wallace, I think Margaret, previous Harvard students who later returned to be research fellows, and some teachers, so forth and so on. So perhaps we can talk around the themes that they covered by way of participating in the process of genealogical unmasking.
Yes. Well, yes, she talked on some of these scientific questions, she talked to Richard Levins from the Harvard School of Public Health and Jonathan Beckwith, who's a microbiologist at Harvard. And Jonathan Beckwith was somebody who talked about still having some of these professors teaching who were people who talked about the need for sterilization and trying to get the society's IQ improved by eugenics. When he was at Harvard as a student, he said a few of them were still left at the institution. And so in some ways, he said that a lot of his life project had been not only to be practicing science, but also to demystify some of the practices that had gone on at the university. And I think it was Levins himself, Stephen Jay Gould, who died, but wrote a book that was called The Mismeasure of Man, about how the IQ and the eugenics movements had gained such dominance over the elite thinkers in the United States. And you also had people who just try to understand how a counter movement of intellectuals developed. Ruth Hubbard was another who brought a feminist perspective on these issues also, because Ruth saw how Harvard also taught some of these ideas that women did not have the brain power to learn, and that it would cause psychological damage to them. And that was, she was another intellectual who Bada read a lot as she was preparing for this work. So there was that scientific angle. Then there were the foreign policy issues.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's where I think she turned a lot to Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky was very generous in talking. He knew a lot of these intellectuals. Even though he had done most of his degree work at the University of Pennsylvania and then he taught most of his career at MIT down the road. He was actually a junior fellow at Harvard for 3 years, which is really one of the most prestigious awards you can get. It's when he had those 3 years, he could develop his linguistics theories, and it was a great time for him. But I think he also, while he was doing very much scientific linguistics work, he was watching these people with their political interests and was often very horrified by some of the things. And I think one of the characters who had so much influence at Harvard in the 50s and 60s was Henry Kissinger. And I think it really bothered Chomsky to see people who would make certain proclamations about the mind of people in the third world and how they don't understand the Western rational way of thinking. And he would often write very critically of their way of framing the issues. And and I think he really got mobilized during the Vietnam War, like a lot of people. And then, of course, Bada's husband also delivered some very devastating criticism in the movie of the foreign policy establishment. And so, I think there's some powerful moments. You had mentioned Victor Wallace, who's a political scientist. And Victor, in some ways, he was an undergraduate at Harvard. Yeah. So he was actually very useful for talking about the experience of being an undergraduate and going through that kind of training and things, because some of us came from other universities. I did my PhD at Harvard, so I certainly saw a lot of things there. But
in which department?
On the history department.
History department.
But what happens is, I think people who especially gone through the undergraduate training, they really see a lot of the traditions and history of the university. They're soaked in it a lot more than people who come from the outside sometimes. And so, Victor could be very good in the film to try to give people a sense of what it was like to be there growing up.
Did you take some courses from the political science department?
When you
were in PhD? Was Samuel Huntington?
He was there, and of course I've written a lot of critical things about Huntington.
That's what I wanted to
Yes. I wrote about the Clash of Civilizations thesis, for instance, in a book called The New Crusades, which is published by Columbia University Press. Michael Sells and Emran Qureshi are the editors. And it's a book that Edward Said contributed to, and Roy Motaheda, several prominent people in Middle Eastern studies. But I'm going to say one possibly nice thing about Huntington, as hard as it is for me sometimes, because I often was very critical of him. But curiously, he went along with this idea of the clash of civilizations. But when it came to the Iraq War, some people took the clash of civilizations and said, yes, we have to get in there and we have to start attacking these enemies and putting them in their place. And Bernard Lewis is an example of a Middle East scholar who was very gung-ho for intervention and warfare. And Huntington said, I don't think that should be the message of my book. I think sometimes we have to try to avoid attacks. Now, admittedly, I disagree very firmly in his belief that there somehow is this civilizational rift where we can't talk to people from different cultures and civilizations, and that it's just, it's deep down, it's probably hopeless that we're always going to be at loggerheads and fighting.
Deeply hopeless in a way, because he's framing it almost epistemologically.
Yeah.
It's as if he's giving us two portraits of two kinds of brains that do not seem to emanate from the same human species, which then in turn produce modalities of belief and ways of thinking that are, even on a biological plane, irreconcilable. It's as if these two human beings with two brains originating in two different cultures could simply not communicate.
Yeah.
I think that is quite pernicious.
Yes,
Very
yes.
dangerous, as a matter of fact.
Yes, and
Don't
I
you
think a lot of people took it in very dangerous ways. Even though Huntington, it turns out, I think was a little more restrained than some of the other people.
His interpreters were.
Yes, yes.
Uh-huh.
And you know, I think in his case, you know, I remember once asking him this. I asked him about Carl Schmitt, who was this very often seen very right-wing thinker who was
Friends
in
of
Nazi
False.
Germany.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
And I asked him, was he very influenced by Schmitt? Because Schmitt really believed you needed to have an enemy. And some people say the followers of Leo Strauss. Now, Strauss is a central
Schmitt.
influence
Correct.
on the neoconservative movement. And Strauss would sometimes say that Western liberalism, if it does not have a coherent enemy, begins to become flabby and decadent, and that you really need to have an enemy because your society will then just fall into ambient decadence.
That's why corruption.
Yeah, and so he thought that, you know, having an enemy served a very useful societal purpose for social cohesion, getting people to be disciplined and dedicated. And I asked Huntington about this. Now, he denied that Schmitt was one of his central influences. He actually said Niebuhr was much more important to him.
Children of light and children of darkness.
And I think, you know, Niebuhr, of course, Niebuhr had this thing that, of course, Chomsky often focused on, talking about necessary illusions, that, you know, sometimes the public couldn't be trusted and they needed some myths and illusions to keep them on the proper path. But so I think he had different influences, but I think deep down fundamentally, Huntington was one of those people who was concerned that, especially after the Cold War, which got the society very disciplined, very centered on a project of unity for the society, what's going to happen now? And people needed the enemy in this kind of way of thinking. You know, a lot of us thought, oh, the Cold War is coming to an end. People started talking about the peace dividend.
That's right.
What happened to this peace dividend?
We have about
Sure.
2 minutes left. John, I could talk to you forever. The interview had only begun, and I cordially invite you to consider being a regular contributor to Afghan Ascent so that you could come once a year and give us a report on the state of labor, labor studies, and marginalized contributions and marginalized voices to the human condition. We'll talk about a series that we could develop along these lines. Now, since this work is in memory of Bada,
Yes.
if there's something in particular that you would like the audience here and the audience in Korea, because this video is going to go to Korea, it's going to be viewed by a Korean audience, that you would like to say in 1 minute or less?
Yes. Well, I want to say, you know, to the Korean people that Bada was a great woman, and you know, I did say this at the memorial service. Margaret, one of the women who spoke, talked about how she was a beautiful person, and I reflected that, you know, sometimes people who have brains and beauty use it to serve the powerful, but she really said that you should, Bada said, work hard to serve the underdog, to help people who were downtrodden, and I think it was really a wonderful, inspiring message. And you know, I think for all of us, we're never going to forget her. We really have to think with our life project to stay focused on the things that she thought were important, and we're going to keep her flame alive.
Okay, this has been your host for Afghan Ascent. Good evening.